His name is Frank Klose, and he covers the Philadelphia Phillies for 97.3 ESPN.com. What's going on, Frank?
Hey, guys. How are you?
Good, man. Good. So I think it's fair, Frank, to say that the Phillies have acquitted themselves well over the last 9 or 10 games. I mean, it was a bad start after the All-Star break, losing the first two to Washington, and then obviously the blowout in the opening game against the Dodgers made us all think that this team was going downhill fast. But to split with the Dodgers and then win 2 out of 3 against a bad Pirates team, they've acquitted themselves well. Is that fair to say right now?
No, I think so. I think when I talked to you and Mike last week, that was right after that 16-2 blowout, and It really didn't feel like this team was going in a good direction. But in the last week, they've gone 4-2, and this is certainly a crucial stretch as they approach the trade deadline where they have to make some very big decisions.
Well, they picked up Drew Smyly. I thought he pitched fairly well for, obviously making his first start. They've got this guy, Mike Morin, and they're rumored to kind of be looking at a lot of guys. Before we even talk about names of guys that they're looking at, something Ryan and I were discussing at length today is kind of how the Phillies, to me, are to us, are in between a rock and a hard place. If you want to go out and get a real top-of-the-line guy like a Bumgarner or maybe even a Zach Greinke, who has the Phillies on his no-trade list, you're going to have to really significantly compete with the bigger guys, which means you have to give up a lot, and they probably don't have as much in their farm system as, say, the Yankees or the Red Sox or some other team. And then that might force them to look at a second-tier starter. One of them is pitching for the Tigers against them tonight. And now you're in the position where do you want to have to give up assets in your farm for a guy who, I don't know, you look at the numbers and some things strike you as really good, but other things may make you wonder if he's really any better than what they already have. So, and they don't have much in their farm system to begin with. So how much do you want to give up? So I see it as a rock and a hard place for the Phillies right now.
Well, I think what the Phillies really need to do, and they kind of did this past winter, is try to find ways to use their financial strength well. When they signed Bryce Harper, he basically just cost them money. Yeah, and a second-round draft pick from next year's draft. Andrew McCutchen cost them money. They really just have to find ways to use that financial ability that other teams don't have to find these advantages. And maybe sometimes it's not the players, it's coaching staff, it's using all these different types of resources that are out there that somebody with money can do, and to try to find ways to make this work. And really, that's what a team that's that hard pressed for talent really needs to do. And they may have paid too much for Bryce Harper. People like to pick apart his numbers, but at the end of the day, they used their money and they added talent, and that's what they just really need to keep doing. Because even the prospects in the system they have, a lot of them don't work out, and that's true of every organization. So. You could talk about organizational depth, but at the end of the day, that depth has to be developed, and they need to really invest every possible resource they have to make sure that who they have is developed. And if the players aren't good enough, they have to find alternatives, even if that means you go out and buy them.
All right, and real quick on that, though, I feel like Andy McPhail, Matt Klentak have come out and said time and again that they're interested in buying bats and developing arms. So for them to go out and buy an arm, as you're suggesting, if they don't have good enough arms, would be them going against their organizational philosophy, which they did once for Arrieta and hasn't really worked out well. Do you really see them, again, getting into that kind of business when they constantly say that that's not the business they want to get into?
Well, at some point, if their way isn't working, they have to bend the rules a little bit. Now, you mentioned Arrieta, and if you look at this trade deadline right now, I do mention him briefly in this week's mailbag, but someone like Zach Greinke, he could potentially just cost you money. And, the Phillies might be able to withstand taking on that salary from Zach Greinke. Maybe you find a way to be a little creative to give yourself a little bit more wiggle room under the competitive balance tax this year by saying to somebody like Arizona, well, we'll take him off your hands, but you need to take Pat Neshek off our hands, whose contract goes away at the end of the year, but it gives us a little bit more wiggle room right now. And then if you can assume that the Greinke contract, you only have one more year of Arrieta after this one, I think you can deal with both of them for 1 year. And then Greinke sort of takes over that slot that Arrieta holds now. So I think you need to think of things in that way. Like how can we find ways to use this strength that we have to add somebody quality like Greinke and essentially not give up much. Yeah, you might throw a small prospect their way who's not much of a prospect. That's usually what happens in trades like that. But I think they just need to say, all right, we've got the pocketbook. Send me your talent you don't want to pay for.
All right, Frank, let's get into the mailbag here. And Sunday, Smyly appears on the mound, and he lets up a run in the first inning, and then he ends up, looking strong, settles in, gets the Phillies 6 innings and a win. Gabe Kapler after the game throws out a Cliff Lee reference, just what Smyly needs and the Philly fans need. But Mark wants to know, does Drew Smyly have a chance to stick in this Phillies starting rotation?
Well, first thing I'll address is that Cliff Lee reference. Now, I wrote this in my pieces over the actually, since the Phillies signed him, I mentioned that right away in the opening paragraph on 97.3 ESPN.com. Drew Smyly, his whole career has been likened to Cliff Lee. This is not something that Gabe Kapler just made up. They both went to Arkansas for college. They're both left-handed. They both have the same agent. There's a similar delivery when you watch Smyly pitch to what Cliff Lee had. And even before, Drew Smyly's entire career, he pitched wearing number 33, except for the past start with the Phillies. So, there's been all kinds of comparisons made between the two over the last several years, since he was a rookie, essentially. And even coming up in the system, as a guy from Arkansas. So I know that, and by the way, that's soundbite for Kapler. It doesn't usually include the part where he's saying, well, I'm not saying he's the extent that Cliff Lee was when he was an ace pitcher. But, yeah, those similarities have been long documented. So, but, when you look at this Phillies rotation, you have now 3 spots that seem like they need help in this Phillies rotation, if not a fourth. Zach Eflin, after that last start, he said after it, he only went 4 innings. He didn't pitch well, and he described himself as feeling heavy, whatever that means. I haven't totally deciphered what that means, but Zach Eflin could be somebody who goes on the injured list. He's somebody who maybe could just use a break from pitching in the starting rotation. That's one slot. Not to mention that Smyly has already taken Nick Pavetta's spot in the starting rotation, and Pavetta is now in the bullpen. That's the second spot in the rotation that really is unsettled. And then there's the whole Vince Velasquez situation, who last start again fails to go 5 innings. Like he has for his entire career. If you look at his whole career, he averages under 5 innings a start. And we all know that that's not a sustainable model, and the Phillies right now have to pitch Vince Velasquez because all the other options really aren't working out either. So this could be a situation where the Phillies add not 1 but 2 starters between now and this trade deadline. And Drew Smyly probably still pitching there in the starting rotation.
It almost sounds like you're saying he's their second best pitcher now, Frank.
Well, yeah, I didn't even mention yet that Arrieta's got the bone chips, and who knows what happens to that. So, what I'm basically saying is, opportunity abounds, and if he can pitch 6 innings every time and give up that 1 run, he's going to keep getting opportunities. And by the way, I will say this: Drew Smyly is somebody I always thought very highly of throughout his career, and the circumstances under which the Phillies are getting him is, he had Tommy John surgery before last season. They knew he wasn't going to pitch. The Cubs signed him to a 2-year deal, hoping to get something out of him this year. And what ended up happening is, there was a situation where if the Cubs let Cole Hamels go as a free agent, the Rangers would have had to buy him out for $7 million. And the contract for Drew Smyly this year was $7 million. And the Cubs basically said to the Rangers they would agree not to make the Rangers pay this buyout if Drew Smyly was taken off their hands. And that's how the Cubs balanced the books. And still coming back from that Tommy John, he wasn't the same with the Rangers. The Brewers didn't have a lot of time to figure it out, although now that Brandon Woodruff is out for several weeks with an injury, they probably wish they still had Smyly around. So the Phillies are really getting the first real opportunity to see if he can come back from that Tommy John to be a very nice pitcher like he was with Detroit and Tampa Bay over the years.
Yeah, that's funny. It's like when the Yankees let Gio Gonzalez go from his minor league deal, and then the day later they had 2 injuries in their pitching staff, and everybody was saying, hey, why did they just let Gio Gonzalez walk? So I think it was Milwaukee that went there. It's funny how that works out.
And funny, Gonzalez's presence in Milwaukee is probably why Smyly decided to opt out.
Yeah, how about that? It all comes full circle.
Wow.
Dave, and we're talking with Frank Klose, who covers the Phillies for 97.3 ESPN.com, and you can read his mailbag here at the website, 97.3 ESPN.com. Frank, David asks, and I think me and Ryan and everybody listening is pretty much the same kind of question, is will the Phillies make a meaningful trade at the deadline. And so you mentioned a bunch of the names that we were talking about today. Before you even answer, your opinion on Matthew Boyd, who they're going to face tonight in Detroit. Obviously, the strikeout numbers are great. The ERA is okay. We've said the same thing about Pivetta and Velasquez at times in our career. They have filthy stuff and can strike out a lot of guys, but don't go long innings and have high ERAs. So is it worth giving up chips for that kind of guy who's not even an all-star and maybe a little more uncertain?
Well, I think Matthew Boyd represents some sense of security or certainty in the fact that he's got a couple of years after this one in his deal, and he's got the opportunity to, or let me put it this way: lefties often take a lot longer to develop. So he seems to be sort of turning the corner into being that developed pitcher, and maybe that's an old school statement that the lefties take longer to develop. But I think the big issue will be what the Tigers want in response. I mean, it sounds like the Tigers are going to want a lot. And why not? Because they have years of control available from him, and there's a lot of teams that need starting pitching. So their ask is going to be pretty high. But that said, the Phillies are still in on him. What we learned the last couple of days is that Matt Klentak is in Detroit with the Phillies, and he's not going there to check out the restaurants in Detroit. Presumably, he's there to meet with Tigers general manager Al Avila, and the Phillies, as Jim Salisbury reported yesterday, are interested in both Boyd and Shane Green, the all-star closer for the Tigers. So when it looks like you're making meaningful trades, or will the Phillies make a meaningful trade, they're certainly working on it. Klentak's presence there is a big sign that they are looking to make some moves. And, tonight Matt Boyd is going to face Aaron Nola. So we'll get to see, even Phillies fans that have only read about him on paper, will get to watch him tonight and see what he might bring to a Phillies team. And perhaps there'll be a long-term left-handed solution in this Phillies starting rotation. But it seems like they're pretty open-minded and in on a lot of other players. Also yesterday, Bob Nightingale of USA Today, he was reporting that the Phillies were talking to Arizona and scouting Arizona to see if either Robbie Ray, who is a lefty signed for next year as well to a reasonable amount, or the aforementioned Greinke might be good trade possibilities. The Phillies are up against some competition looking for starting pitchers. I haven't heard much about the Phillies linked to Marcus Stroman, who's somebody that could be moved. I haven't really seen much smoke over Madison Bumgarner, the often mentioned trade candidate. So it seems like the Phillies are looking at people that they can control beyond this year. And when you talk about the high price, I think that's what it's going to come down to. Are they willing to pay the price, or are they not willing to pay the price? Again, we're not talking money. We're talking prospects usually. The lone exception maybe being Greinke, who, if they could take him off the Arizona Diamondbacks' hands, they might have a shot to do something. But I think the Phillies are certainly talking, and really what they decide to do between now and then, it's really hard to say, because every step of the way they've blocked the quote-unquote high prices. And we knew this past offseason they were in on Mike Minor, who the scouting department seemed to be spot on for Mike Minor, that he was going to break out and have a big season. But they didn't want to pay the price. And now I bet you Mike Minor's much, much more expensive, and who knows if the Rangers will even trade him at this point. But the Phillies seem like they're in on looking to make an impactful move, preferably one that involves players they can control beyond this year.
All right, Frank, let's get to one more here in the mailbag before we have to let you go. Tony wants to know, speaking with on the topic of trying to make trades for the Phillies, who they have in the farm system, Tony wants to know who's untouchable in the Phillies system for trades for the deadline.
Well, I would say the one name that stands out as untouchable right now, and that's Alex Bohm. That's the Phillies' top prospect. Right now he's playing third base in the minor leagues. He may or may not stick at third base. I think the Phillies would like to do what current Tiger Nicholas Castellanos did, which was come up as a third baseman and then eventually move to the outfield. But when you look through the system, the Phillies have two top 100 prospects. One is Bohm, who comes in at 37, and Adonis Medina comes in at 76 on the MLB pipeline. But that said, I think that actually Spencer Howard is the next name that they'd be less likely to trade. Howard is currently at Class A Reading. He was Class A Clearwater, and could move up to Reading perhaps soon. He's somebody who He's made 9 starts at that level, 1.79 ERA, very promising right-handed arm. I think the Phillies would love to hang on to him if at all possible with some trades, and perhaps even trade Medina if it helped them land one of these controllable starters. You know, you're giving up 6 years of control for Medina. You want to get at least a couple out of these starters that they might acquire. So I think that Bohm is the untouchable. Spencer Howard is close. Medina they might move, and I think the Phillies would like to keep one of Adam Haseley or Mickey Moniak. Haseley's had a nice week with a couple doubles, couple home runs. You're seeing what he can do, but the Phillies could use somebody to play center field in between Andrew McCutchen and Bryce Harper the next couple seasons, and perhaps it'll be one of those guys. So I think they might want to keep one of them. Maybe they'll trade one. And, with McCutchen in left and Harper in right and the potential of Bohm moving to left field long term, you don't have a whole lot of space in that outfield. And as we saw this year, you can sign 2 starting outfielders in free agency. That's not a position you really need to concern yourself too much. So I think Bohm is the untouchable. Prefer to keep Howard and one of those 2 outfielders. That's what I would say the Phillies are looking at in terms of their system.
All right, that was Frank Klose, and the MLB trade deadline is next week. Frank, thanks so much for joining us. We'll obviously be posted and talking to you throughout the next week as we get close to that deadline and see what the Phillies do. Have a good one, Frank.
Should be a good one. You too, guys.
Frank joins us courtesy of the Boardwalk Honda Hotline.